Okay, we're going to pick up here on Roman numeral 4, which is going to be the juxtaglomerular complex. So let's take a look at the structure here. So the juxtaglomerular complex. Number 1 is juxtaglomerular cells. Okay, so let's find those, these juxtaglomerular cells. These are cells that are actually found within the afferent arteriole, and they're going to secrete renin. So remember that renin increases your blood pressure indirectly, doesn't immediately do that, but it catalyzes, it starts a chemical sort of chain reaction, okay? But that's where they're made, these juxtaglomerular cells that secretes renin. Number 2, the macula densa. All right, so these are very densely packed cells that are found in the DCT, the distal convoluted tubule. And these cells are a little bit like chemoreceptors, right? They're going to be able to monitor the solute concentration in the filtrate or the fluid running through the DCT. And so they can tell, these cells can tell basically if you have a lot of water, it's a dilute solute concentration, or maybe you're dehydrated and the solute concentration is very concentrated. Things like that. Okay, so they're monitoring that solute concentration. And then number 3, the extraglomerular mesangial cells, which you guys can just say mesangial cells. We can leave the extraglomerular out. Mesangial cells are found sandwiched in between these two, and your mesangial cells are going to secrete erythropoietin, right? The EPO, which is the abbreviation for erythropoietin, is going to stimulate red blood cell production. Okay, let's look at the vasculature of the kidneys. So you're going to want to know, excuse me as I scroll, you're going to want to know this picture, this diagram, and know all the blood vessels here. So let's start. I listed the blood vessels in your outline in order. So when blood comes into the kidney, it comes in with the renal artery, and you should already know this one. Then once it splits, it becomes segmental, okay? So you have segments of the kidney, that's why they're called segmental. But remember that when a blood vessel splits, it usually changes name. So when you see this bifurcation here of this blood vessel, you're going to call this segmental. It's no longer renal artery. Okay, renal artery is just this right here. So there's our segmental artery right here. This would be a segmental artery. The segmental arteries will become interlobar arteries as they move between the lobes. So this is just going to be positional, right? So segmental comes up, and then right between the lobes. Oh, you know what? I think I forgot to mention a lobe. A lobe is, if you wanted to get a piece of the kidney pie and get a little section, a whole pyramid as well as the cortex. So if you watch my cursor, I'm just going to do a triangle here, go up, go around, and down. That's a lobe, okay? And actually, if you look at the very first diagram, a lobe is, there's a dotted line telling you what a lobe is. Anyways, between the lobes, right? So basically we're talking about in the renal columns, you have the blood vessels here. So this is going to be interlobar artery, interlobar vein. So interlobar arteries will come up, we're still in the artery. So the interlobar arteries will come up between the lobes, or otherwise you can say it's in the renal column. And then they're going to split and they're going to follow the base of your renal pyramid. So at this point, they're called the arcuate because they're going to arc over the medulla. So this right here is the arcuate artery. Then they're going to branch, little branches off the arcuate into the cortex. So those are called cortical radiate arteries. That makes sense, right? Cortical radiate, they're radiating into the cortex. Then from there, those cortical radiate arteries will branch and form those afferent arterioles. Okay, so remember those afferent arterioles, if we blow this up, it's the afferent arterioles that lead into our renal corpuscle and the efferent arteriole that comes away. So if you follow my outline, the afferent arterioles become the glomerulus. The glomerulus will exit the renal corpuscle as efferent arteriole. The efferent arterioles will wrap around the nephron, becoming peritubular capillaries, right? And then those capillaries will become veins then. So the first vein we're creating is called the cortical radiate vein, or I know this is confusing, but it's also called the interlobular vein. not to get confused with interlobar vein. Interlobar is, there's artery and veins, the same word. It's within that renal column between the lobes, okay? So I do remember at one point they changed the name. These were both called cortical radiate artery and vein, and then for some reason they became interlobular. So your textbook likes to call the veins interlobular veins, the arteries cortical radiate arteries. So in the notes I have cortical radiate vein because you can just say that. So either one, if you want to remember cortical radiate vein, that's fine. If you want to remember interlobular vein, that's fine. Okay, so we have these veins that are going to be exiting the cortex. They're going to join in with the arcuate vein. The arcuate vein becomes the interlobar vein. The interlobar vein then becomes renal vein. So there's no segmental veins here. So let's take a look at this picture. Here's our arcuate veins, right? So let's actually start at the top. Here's our interlobular veins. The interlobular veins are going to connect with the arcuate, right? So the arcuate's labeled down here. The arcuate vein is going to drain into here. So once it becomes in between the lobes, that's called interlobar vein. Interlobar vein remains interlobar vein until it gets to renal vein. So there's no segmental. There's a segmental artery, segmental artery, but no segmental veins. All right, that is your blood flow, vasculature through the kidney. Okay, and this is another nice detail in this picture. See this nephron, how it's higher up in the cortex? This is a cortical nephron. You see this nephron, how it's reaching lower down. The loop is very far reaching into the medulla. This is your juxtamedullary nephron. So it's labeled here, juxtamedullary nephron, cortical nephron. Here is a question for you. You can pause it to think about it. The answer is going to be arcuate, okay, because they're going to arc over the base of the medulla that faces the cortex. From the glomerulus, the efferent arteriole enters which vessels? So pause it if you want to think about it. The answer is letter A, peritubular capillaries. All right, moving on to the ureters. So the ureters are pretty simple. They're just going to be tubes that are leading or taking the urine that's created in the kidney into the bladder. This is a really interesting congenital abnormality. There's 2 ureters coming out of this kidney. There should only be 1. Okay, what do you need to know about the ureters? Small muscular tubes. So they're smooth muscle, okay? So there's smooth muscle here along the wall. There, if you remember way back to the beginning of the semester, we talked about transitional epithelium and how transitional epithelium is found in the urinary system. It's designed to stretch, right? So here we have the first, actually the pelvis and the calyces also have some transitional epithelium, but you want to know that the ureter has transitional epithelium, and smooth muscle squeezes with peristalsis, right? Peristaltic contraction squeezes the urine into your bladder. So even if you were upside down, urine would still get into your bladder because it's not gravity that pulls it down. It's the peristalsis. So let's take a look at the entryway into the bladder. So if you look at number 3 in your under ureters, there is an oblique entry of the ureter into the bladder. So here are your ureteral openings, okay? They're not a complete circle. They're kind of slit-like openings because you don't want urine, if you have a really full bladder, you don't want it to backflow up your ureters into the kidney, right? That would not be good. So they're going to limit that backflow with this anatomical structure, and that is that significance, okay? If you look at the bladder, so now we are looking at the bladder, and this is another good image to know all the terms. A bladder is also a smooth muscled hollow organ. So all this is smooth muscle. The smooth muscle that creates the bladder is running in different directions. and together as a unit, they're called the detrusor muscle. Okay, so this is the muscle of the bladder itself. Now, let's look at the number 3 in your outline. Trigone, which is here, this word or this word. It's the dotted line. It's a triangular area. So think of a funnel, right? The bladder itself, most of the bladder is going to have rugae. This is the same rugae as in your stomach. It's folds in the wall so that when it fills up with urine, it can stretch. It has extra tissue. So this is a little bumpy, and then you're going to have this area called the trigone that's going to be smooth, and so it helps the urine flow out of the bladder. It's demarcated by 3 openings, the 2 ureteral openings and the 1 urethral opening. Okay, so that's the trigone. The dotted line is all around those 3 openings. So I talked about the rugae. Number 5, that's the lining of your bladder's transitional epithelium. Now let's take a look at our sphincters, the 6 and 7. So we have an internal urethral sphincter, which is literally just part of the wall of the bladder itself. So this is going to be smooth muscle, right? Then you have a separate external urethral sphincter. So this is just like the anal sphincters. If you remember from the digestive system, the internal anal sphincter was smooth muscle. The external anal sphincter is skeletal muscle. Same thing here. So when you are learning to get potty trained as a child and you learn to squeeze the muscle, even now you can squeeze the muscle that holds your urine in. You're squeezing this muscle here, which is called the urogenital diaphragm. So I want you guys to know this muscle is named the urogenital diaphragm. Sometimes people call this your pelvic floor. And the external urethral sphincter is a special region of this muscle, which is around the urethra. And then when this muscle contracts, it collapses the urethra. Okay, it holds your urine in. So that's that. So they're separate locations. And then the last thing, number 8 on the outline, is baroreceptors. If you remember that, that's going to be the receptors that can detect stretch. So all along the bladder wall, you're going to have baroreceptors that can tell, right? You know when your bladder is full because of the stretch of the wall due to the baroreceptors. I'll tell you a quick story. Astronauts, when they go into space, they don't know that their bladder is filling because the way that we evolved with gravity is that the water, right, the urine is going to lay on the bottom of our bladder, and the walls here on the bottom is going to get stretched, right? It's going to weigh down and stretch the walls before the entire bladder gets filled with water. I'm saying water, but it's urine. In space with 0 gravity, the urine doesn't go down to the bottom. There's no reason for the urine to go down to the bottom of the bladder. It clings to any side of the bladder. So there's no stretch felt at any time unless your bladder has completely filled with urine, and then you finally get a stretch. So at that point, it might be an emergency. And if you're doing what they call like a spacewalk, you can't quickly go back inside and go to the bathroom. So astronauts have to schedule bathroom breaks because they really have no idea if their bladder is filling or not. Okay, let's talk about the urethra. So the urethra, there's going to be an internal and external urethral orifice. So if you take a look at maybe not this picture. Actually, let's just stay here for a quick second before we move on. I usually ask my class, is this a picture of a male, female, or unisex bladder? And the answer is male because there's a prostate gland, okay? So when we get to this part, the male and female urethra is going to be different, and the male urinary system is going to overlap with the reproductive system because the urethra is used both for the passage of urine as well as the passage of semen in reproduction, right? So the prostate gland, I want you guys to take a look at the position. The prostate gland rests against the bladder, and the urethra of the male is going to run through the prostate gland, okay? So when we name parts of the male urethra, there's 3 parts. This one's going to be called the prostatic urethra, the part that runs through the prostate gland. Then once we finish with the prostate gland and we're running through that muscle I told you about, it's called the membranous urethra. So as it runs through the urogenital diaphragm, it's called the membranous urethra. And then after that, it's called the spongy urethra, because in the penis, the tissue is called the corpus spongiosum, and that's what the urethra runs through. Let's just take a look at this is the posterior side of the male bladder, and I know it's the male bladder because there's two things here. Three things actually. There's the prostate gland, which has been sort of bisected, so there's half of the prostate gland. There is something called the seminal gland. There's two of them, here, and those glands make semen, so does the prostate gland. And then there's another structure here, which is the vas deferens. That's going to, it's called the ductus deferens here, but it's going to bring the sperm to pick up the semen created in the seminal gland and prostate gland. So this is distinctly male. The female bladder would have none of these structures. All right, contraction of which muscle compresses the urinary bladder and expels its contents into the urethra? So pause to think about it. The answer is letter D, the detrusor muscle. So a lot of people, when they guess this in class, they'll guess one of the sphincters. But the sphincters, when they contract, they're going to keep the urine in the bladder. They're not going to push or expel the urine out. When you go to the bathroom, why is your bladder a smooth muscle? Because it pushes the urine out. So your bladder will contract and it squeezes the urine out while you're urinating. All right, so let's take a look at the female urethra and other structures here. So here are the terms internal urethral sphincter. Oops, that's the sphincter. I was going to say orifice. So if my pointer right here, this is your internal urethral orifice. It's the orifice that faces the bladder. This that faces outside would be the external urethral orifice. So you want to find the bladder. The bladder here is a smooth muscled hollow structure, but be careful. There's another, in women, there's another smooth muscled hollow structure called the uterus. The uterus is superior to the bladder. Just think about pregnant women having to pee all the time because the pregnancy, right, the baby in the womb is pushing on their bladder the whole time. So the more inferior structure is the bladder. And so if you can recognize the bladder, then the structure coming out from the bladder, this is the urethra. If you see the uterus, right, what's our line coming away from the uterus? That's the vagina. So the opening that leads towards the uterus is the vagina. The opening that leads towards the bladder is the urethra. Okay, so where's our urogenital diaphragm? Here it is. Okay, so you see this muscle that goes across like this. This is the urogenital diaphragm, right? This is skeletal muscle, so this is what you squeeze. So that's why the external urethral sphincter is here, and the internal urethral sphincter is part of the bladder wall. You can see the position of the bladder. It's posterior to the pubic symphysis. Okay, and in terms of the other structures in this picture, I'll leave that for the reproductive system. Let's look at the male bladder. I'm sorry, male urethra and bladder. So here's the bladder. Here's the ureter coming into it. So remember the male, on the posterior surface of the male bladder, there's other reproductive structures that we looked at. Here's our prostate gland. This is the seminal gland. This is the gland that makes semen, as well as the prostate gland. And then this structure here is a continuation of the vas deferens. So this tube is going to bring sperm into the pelvic cavity, go behind the bladder. Okay, so this ductus deferens, which is what the tube is called, will come behind the bladder on the posterior side of the bladder and then meet up with the seminal gland and the prostate gland. So there's two grooves that run through the prostate gland, as you can see. This groove here is called the ejaculatory duct, and I'll talk more about this in the reproductive system. This is the prostatic urethra, right? So if it's from the bladder, straight from the bladder, that's your prostatic urethra. There is a junction here with the ejaculatory duct. And so the prostatic urethra will meet up, run through the urogenital diaphragm. Here we have called the membranous urethra. And then everything else is called the spongy urethra or penile urethra, but I think your textbook favors spongy urethra. Okay, so now I think I'm done with this. So the rest of this items here I'll talk about during the reproductive system. Here's our last little, the UTI. So if you're looking at urethra, letter B, in women, the external urethral orifice is posterior to the clitoris and anterior to the vaginal opening, which we actually don't see that. I don't have a picture of that. We'll see that in the reproductive system. But this is actually showing you that women, right, urinary tract infections, let me just mention that urinary tract infections are bladder infections. The bacteria that exist in the mucous membrane or in the skin around the urethra can work their way into the urethra and colonize their way all the way into the bladder, right? So look at the distance that bacteria have to go on a woman versus the distance bacteria have to go on the male, right? So it's very different. That's why women tend to get UTIs much, much more commonly than men do, is because the distance is just so much shorter that bacteria are more likely to colonize a woman's bladder than a male bladder. And also the orifice, right, the opening here is very close to the anus, which harbors bacteria that can cause urinary tract infections. In fact, most urinary tract infections are caused by these bacteria that are normally found in the colon, E. coli being one of these. One of the ways to prevent urinary tract infections is to go to the bathroom more often, right, to urinate, because when you urinate, the urine flushes clean the urethra, and so that flushing action can stop bacteria from moving up and colonizing the bladder. All right, so I think I talked about everything here. C, in men, the urethra has 3. I talked about those things. And then the last letter, D, is just the word micturition, which is the same as urination. So when you go to the bathroom, you're micturating. So here's the last question for you. Blood or large proteins in the urine can be a sign of kidney problems. What region of the kidney is most likely damaged with these symptoms? So pause it if you want to think about it. The answer is letter C, the glomerulus, because that glomerulus is part of the filtration membrane. Remember, we talked about a coffee filter holds things back. If you're finding blood or large proteins in your urine, your filter is not working, and the glomerulus is part of that filter. Let me just say this, that if you do have a urinary tract infection, you can find blood in your urine, but the blood did not come from the kidney. The blood can come from the bladder. So if you're having a urinary tract infection, it's normal to find red blood cells and white blood cells in the urine, but it's originating from the bladder itself, not from the kidney. So don't worry about that you have kidney damage if you find blood in your urine or white blood cells in the urine, because it could be just a bladder infection. And we're done.